Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sustainability Workshop. I'm delighted to be leading this workshop, and on behalf of Hunter Environmental Consulting, I would like to extend a warm welcome to you for presenting this workshop. So the title of workshop, as you see, is Sustainability Workshop, Sustainability Check. This workshop has two primary goals. Firstly, provide an overview of sustainability legislations and initiative in Australia. We look at the also recently approved legislation and initiative in the past couple of years, as well as the emerging one. And the second objective of this workshop is to discuss the capacity and capabilities that companies in general need to have to comply with the new legislation. So let's start the presentation. Before starting that, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owner of the lands on which I'm presenting this workshop to you. I pay my respect to the elders, past and present, and also to the elders of other communities who may present in this workshop. This is the overview of the workshop. We initially introduce Hunter Environmental Consulting to you, and then we'll talk about sustainable development goals and its relation to this workshop. Then we will talk about emerging sustainability legislation and initiatives in Australia. And in the fourth part, we talk about how to comply with these legislation and initiatives. At the end, we will have a discussion about the topics that we previously covered in the workshop. Hunter Environmental Consulting, it's a new Newcastle-based consulting company. It has multiple consulting services, including sustainability, contaminated land management, environmental management, and other services. So basically, it's a multidisciplinary consulting team. As for sustainability services, broadly, we have two main sustainability products or services. The first one focuses on areas like decarbonization, circular economy, and sustainable governance. We also provide risk advisory services to companies, for example, modern slavery risks and climate-related financial risk that I'll touch these two areas in more detail later on in this presentation. About myself, I have a multiple postgraduate qualification, including a PhD in engineering. So my PhD was focused on circular economy and sustainable waste management in Australia. I have also a master's degree by research from Victoria University, which was about business models for sustainable water management in the Australian context. In addition to this qualification, I have a bachelor's degree and master's degree from Tehran University and Shiraz University in Iran. Both of them focus on sustainability, including urban heat island and urban air pollution. I started my career at the United Nations when my role was to manage internationally funded sustainability or environmental projects in Iran. I worked at the United Nations for 4 or 5 years, and then I came to Australia. I started my first job in a company, engineering company called Parsons Brinkerhoff. My role was resource efficiency and climate change consultant. I then moved to RMIT University, where I was doing both lecturing and research. And my role was to conduct life cycle assessment, LCA, which is an internationally recognized tool in environmental assessment. So I worked a couple of years at RMIT University. Then I moved to New South Wales government in a agency, and my role was to provide greenhouse mitigation strategy for the agriculture sector. I then moved to similar government agency in Victoria, and my focus was to develop um, climate change adaptation strategy for Victoria. I also had my own consulting company called Decision Balance, in which I worked about 5 or 6 years. In 2022, I joined Hunter Environmental Consulting as a sustainability principal. And I've been in this exciting project for about a year, and that's has given me the opportunity to work in a number of projects, interesting projects, including modern slavery, decarbonization, and also sustainability governance. As for publications, I have a number of peer-reviewed publications, journal articles in sustainability. I'm also try to publish articles in sustainability in my LinkedIn page. So I suggest that if you are interested in the area that I work, to visit the publication and the articles that I have on my LinkedIn page. So now let's start about talk about sustainability. So the first definition of sustainability called sustainability development. It was first introduced more than 40 years ago in a conference in Brazil. So that definition is that the development that meets the present needs without compromising the ability of the future generation to meet their own needs. This definition has been used by organizations, countries in different levels to set up sustainability goals. So one of the most important sustainability framework that we have in international level is the sustainability goals developed by the United Nations. So you see that we have 17 sustainability goals. These sustainability development goals are varied in terms of nature. Some of them, for example, the top two, there are more about social aspects of sustainability. We have some of them related to governance and how institutions can manage sustainability and achieve the sustainability goals. We have also a number of sustainability goals related to environmental and financial aspect. So if we look at as a whole to sustainability development goals as a whole, it's actually a multifaceted objective. As you see, it's like a diamond. So it has different facets. Some of the facets that, let's imagine, they are visible in this picture to us. It include social aspect or social dimension, environmental, financial, as well as um, other facets like ethical, institutional, and others. So as you see in these two pictures, sustainability is the multifaceted objective that has different dimensions. Now let's look at this sustainability trends in the past 40 years. I started my consulting job or study in sustainability in 1980. At that time, the main topics was pollution prevention, for example, how to minimize waste in the wastewater which is discharged to the environment or to areas like air pollution. In 1990s, it's evolved to a new subject or area called resource efficiency, how to save energy, water, and minimize waste, for example. In 2000s, it's evolved to another level, and it included projects in decarbonization and product stewardship. So companies, governments in different levels focus on the new area of climate change, as well as managing the life cycle of a product and indicating responsibility in terms of who is paying the cost of environmental expenses, damages. In 2010, it just extend to another layer, which is circular economy, that I'll talk more about that in this presentation. Changing the economy from a linear fashion that we have production, use, and then disposal. And we create a loop and recycle or return the products to another life cycle. In the current, the case that we are in 2020s, as you say, we have the previous area of importance or sustainability, as well as moving to a more social dimension of sustainability. We have, for example, in Australia, Gender Equality Act in 2020, Modern Slavery Act in 2018. So that's changes that happen in the current situation, in the current decades, and we are in. In terms of what will happen in the future, there is not certain yet, but we can talk about or consider some area like financial sustainability, biodiversity. These would be the areas that we have more legislation or initiative or commitments from companies or countries, governments in different levels. So sustainability legislation and initiatives that I will cover in this workshop in the future, in the upcoming slides, they are in the national levels. We have some of them in a state level, and some of them they are industry commitments. The first one, which is in a national level, is the Climate Change Act 2022. So that set up emission target for Australia. And it says that as a nation, we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emission by 43% level that we had in 2005 by 2030. So by 2030, we need to reduce our emission by 43%. And the reference point is the emissions that we had in 2005. There is also a big commitment, which is net zero emissions by 2050. So as a nation, we still can have greenhouse gas emissions, but it should be balanced by the emissions that we manage and we stop producing them. The second sustainability legislation that's is likely to come in force in late 2023, this year or early next year. That's called climate-related financial disclosure. So you may have heard about an initiative that's called TCFD, which is a stand for climate-related financial disclosures. That initiative more about identification of climate related financial risk. So that framework is well established, and it's been adopted by many companies in the large scale and medium scale. And it talks about the transition risk that we have because of climate change, as well as physical risk and other type of risk. So it's more likely that we will have similar one in a national level in Australia. That legislation will require companies to disclose information about their climate-related financial risk and opportunity to their shareholders and stakeholders, and those risks need to be audited by an independent auditor. There is also another emerging legislation is called Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. So it's basically a classification system that define economic activities, which one should be considered as a sustainable and which one not. And it is still in the process of development, and it might come to force in 2025, in 2 years. So it is expected that this piece of legislation increase the flow of capital and investment in sustainable finance, and also it minimize the risk of greenwashing. And the main benefit of that, it would be for investors to just compare the investment opportunities that they have from a lens of sustainability. There is also a change in some existing and old legislation and act. For example, there is a one called Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Amendment that it's just introducing national environmental standards to create a clear benchmarking for environmental protection. And it suggests that the establishment of a new environmental power in Australia to implement the act. And it's anticipated that this legislation improve public participation in decision makings. So it's more engaging the public to say what they expect and hope from environmental standards in Australia. There are also some industry-specific legislation. One of them is National Packaging Recycling Scheme that it is expected to be launched in next year. And initially, it will focus on soft plastic packaging. That at the moment, the recycling rate of them is very low. It's about 4% in a national level. And the reason that recycling is such a low level because that soft plastic, it's a blend of different plastic and sometimes they are contaminated. So the recycling of them is not easy. So the idea is to ask food and beverage companies to pay a levy for the packaging they sell in Australia. And then they use that levy for collection and recycling of soft plastic that the companies used. We have in the agriculture sector one emerging sustainability initiative. It's called National Fertilizer Strategy that might come to force in 2024 or introduced next year. And talk about improving the efficiency of fertilizers. As you know, some fertilizer, for example, ammonia or nitrogen fertilizer, they contribute to greenhouse gas emission from the agriculture sector. And the portion of them to the total greenhouse gas emission from the agriculture sector is significant. 10 years ago, I did a life cycle assessment about cotton production system in Australia, and that the result has been published. And that study just estimate that how much of total carbon footprint of 1 ton of cotton produced in Australia is related to use of nitrogen fertilizer. So some countries, including Canada and New Zealand, they have asked farmers to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 30% in 2030, for example, in a few years. And that might be the same things happen in Australia, or they could be just focus on educating and more research and development in this area. There is also one industry commitment by Australian Trucking Association, and it's focused on decarbonization. They have a target of greenhouse gas emission reduction by 44%, which is similar to the national target for reducing greenhouse gas emission by 2030, and also a net zero emission target in 2020. So it's very similar to the National Greenhouse Gas Emission Act. And it just, in terms of educating truck drivers, investing in new technologies, using electrical vehicles and hydrogen fuel. So that's will be a big transformation in the trucking industry, and it just represents industry-specific commitment in sustainability. There is also one stewardship program in agriculture sector. It's about biodiversity, which is, as I mentioned before, is going to be an area of change in the sustainability domain. And it's a voluntary in Australia, and it just gives the landholders to say biodiversity certificates to businesses, and it's hope that stewardship increase investment in biodiversity and conservation on private land. There is also one national strategy, National Environment Restoration Strategy, and it is expected to be complete into next year. And it just talk about, as the name implies, is about restoration, habitat, or threatened species, and it's more focused on biodiversity and environmental restoration. And one of the potential benefits of this strategy is to engage more community in restoration activities. Now let's have a look to the impact that these regulations and acts and industry commitments they might have on businesses in Australia. So the impacts, I have classified them in two groups. One of them is direct impacts. Direct impacts is the impacts that business feel it directly. For example, they have to they must comply with the new legislation schemes. And we have the indirect impacts, which is about the impacts that a business feel it or have it because it's supply chain, they have to comply with the legislation. Let's start from the first one, direct impacts. Here in this slide, I suggest a kind of like a approach to the direct impacts. That approach includes 4 steps. Step 1 is data collection. If you are a business and you need to comply with a piece of legislation, act, or any industry commitment, this approach suggests that you start with collecting data from your business. The second step is to turning the data that you have collected to insights. And the third stage is to come up with a number of recommendations and strategies on how to best comply with the introduce or enforce legislation and initiatives. And the last stage, you reach to compliance state. So to best describe this proposed approach, I have 2 example or applications. Application 1 focuses on modern slavery, which is a social issue related to human rights. And we have roughly about 40 million people in slavery in the world. And when we talk about modern slavery, it has different practices. For example, forced labor, which is about 25 million of these people, they are actually forced labor. They have to work. And about 50 million of people is about forced marriage, which is still considered as a modern slavery, the practice in this one. And we have also about the other practices like a child labor. So some of the practices that not covered in the previous slide include debt bondage, harboring a victim, human trafficking. So it's a list of common slavery, modern slavery practices. In Australia, we have the Modern Slavery Act 2018. The act requires some entities. When we say some entities, means there is a threshold to meet for reporting modern slavery statement. At the moment, the threshold is about one annual revenue of $100 million. And there is a discussion that it just reduced to a lower value, for example, $50 million per year. And these companies that they trigger that threshold, they must report on the risk of modern slavery in their operation, in their own business, and also in their supply chains. And also discuss how they going to mitigate these risks. Okay, so the first step is, as I mentioned before, is collecting data. So the best set of data for companies to report on modern slavery in their operation and their supply chains is just look at today's suppliers. Here is the picture or a slide that shows, for example, a business have different suppliers and each one with the different spending menu. Some of them big and some of them small. So that's a data collection stage that you need as a first step. If you wanted to focus on modern slavery in your supply chains, you just identify who are your suppliers and how much in terms of value you just give them. Second step is just turning the data that you have collected to insight. This figure it just show where are your hotspots in terms of modern slavery. So the biggest spending for you is just you pay to the suppliers that subcontract part of your business. This is the example of a one typical business. And then there are how much you pay for marketing, how much you pay for equipment purchasing, and etc. It's just turning the data to insight and the connection and finding the hotspot in your supply chain. That's hotspot. It just give you that. It's better to consider all, but especially focus on the suppliers that they have a more complex production system or supply chain, and they contribute significantly to your supply chain. The third stage is to develop a strategy. So in terms of modern slavery companies, they should have some policies and procedures for managing or mitigating modern slavery risk in their own operation, in their own business. And you also need a strategy to manage the risk of the modern slavery in your business from your suppliers. Example of internal strategies: you develop modern slavery policy, whistleblowing policy, grievance policy, and others. So you need to have systems and structures in place to mitigate those risks in your organization, within your business. Example of strategies that you can use to comply with the Modern Slavery Act is to just engage with your suppliers, provide education and training if they don't have that capacity in terms of modern slavery, and help them to work with you to minimize the risk in the supply chain. You can also include modern slavery clauses in the contract that you have with your suppliers to just highlight the importance of modern slavery for your business and the expectation that you have from your suppliers. There is another good practice that you develop a supplier code of conduct document and share it with your suppliers. We think that um, policy or statement document, you can specify what expectation you have from your suppliers. So as you say in the previous slide, which is related to internal strategy, and this slide, which is focuses on external strategies, to comply with the Modern Slavery Acts, the key or the one important activity is to develop policies and creating system and structure in place. So that's the key things that you can do to comply with the legislation. The fourth stage, which is about compliance, here is a one proposed approach to create governance for effective compliance with the legislation, with the Modern Slavery Act. We suggest that you create a committee, internal committee, it's called a Sustainable Sourcing Committee, with the representative from different departments, for example, in the marketing, finance, and sales, etc. And the committee create, or its role is to be developing KPI, for example, how many of your clients or people in your organization needs to do modern slavery training, for example, in the first quarter of the year and the second quarter, and how many of your suppliers they should receive supplier code of conduct per year, and monitoring their performance. So that's a kind of typical KPIs that you can develop for the Modern Slavery Act, and then apply those KPIs into the business, getting feedback, and feedback comes back to the Sustainable Sourcing Committee, and it's just created a reinforcing loop and strengthening your capacity to comply with the legislation. So the second application here is about circular economy. As I mentioned it earlier, we are in the transition from a linear economy to a circular economy. And here you see of a picture that suggests how circular economy in the construction sector can work. We have an extraction of materials. It's coming to manufacturing. We just use them in a building, and then after the end of life of the building or infrastructure project, that we use that material, recycle them, and then create another building, another infrastructure, and this loops continues. But the system also can't be fully closed, so there would be some waste is coming generated in the loop, which is okay, but we need to focus on reducing that disposal stream as much as possible. Now let's have a look and see the application of the proposed approach for complying with the legislation in the case study. The case study here is that a business that been asked by the local water company to decrease the level of the salt that the company is generate and discharge it to the town wastewater system or plant. So the driver for this one is that there is a water shortage in the region, and the water company, the local water company, intends to have a circular economy water sector, and that's business model is that water is coming to wastewater treatment system, being treated and then recycled back to the environment for example, irrigation application. One issue that salt in a wastewater can cause in this circular economy is that most of the wastewater treatment plant, they don't have the equipment that allow them to remove salt from water. The equipment that they are in most wastewater treatment plants around the world, it's practical and useful for removing fat, grease, and etc., but not for removing salt. So salt it's just ion in the water and it's really hard to remove. So what happens if a company, a wastewater treatment company, use recycled water without removing its salt? The issue that might happen is that if we use that salty water for irrigation, there will be buildup of salt in the soil, in a irrigation systems, in agriculture system, and then that salt in the soil can negatively impact the yield of the product. So after a few years irrigation by salty water, the land that been irrigated by salty water then might have a very reduced yield. So you can't harvest as much as you used to harvest in the past when you irrigated with clean water and not salty water. So that can cause a sustainability issue. The first step, as I mentioned before, is collecting data. For example, look at your wastewater and see how much wastewater you generate in terms of volume. Look at to the wastewater pH, salt, and then also organic matter in your wastewater. You can collect the data in terms of fluctuation of wastewater, daily ups and downs in quality of wastewater and volume of wastewater that you have, and you have a weekly data and even monthly data. The second stage is to turn this data into insight. For example, you just come up with the fishbone approach. You just visualize that how much salt is coming from the production line, how much is coming from warehouse and other activities. For example, if you wash your trucks in the company and you use water that water from washing process, and they have salt in it as well. So amenity is another source of salt. So it's a first insight. And the second insight that is useful for this case study is to just look at the source of the salt in the company. For example, raw materials that might have a TDS in-house salt in it, and then you look at more detail about cleaning agent, that soup and detergent that you use, and just quantify how much salt is coming from them. So we're going down and down, digging down to see what are the sources of salt generation in the business. In terms of a strategy, you have a good strategy that it's called waste management hierarchy. So the waste management hierarchy, it has different layer or based on the environmental benefit that they have. For example, if we avoid waste, so there would be very reduced waste. And then it just coming to the bottom, which is the dispose of waste, which is the less preferred strategy in terms of environmental performance. So this hierarchy is just lay out the options that you have. It's applicable for every waste and most waste, and it's a good framework to start with in terms of developing a strategy. So you can use this hierarchy as a framework and come up with the strategy that you have. So the possible strategies that you have is you have focus on the, for example, the top and most favorite option, which is waste avoidance. You look at as using detergents that they have very or no even salt in it, if possible, technically possible. And in terms of reuse of the waste water in your plant, you can look at to the, for example, using wastewater from process A and use it in process B. So look at to the these reuse options. You can, in terms of energy recovery, look at to anaerobic lagoons, anaerobic digestion, if you have an organic waste in it. And in the treating waste, you can have reverse osmosis. So in terms of ranking options, what is its suggestion to using a multi-criteria assessment exercise? Because the options that listed here, they are good in terms of environmental performance. But as we previously discussed, we have a social dimension in sustainability as well as the financial aspect as well. So being good in terms of environmental performance, it doesn't mean that it's the best options. So we suggest that after identifying a strategy, you rank them based on performance in sustainability. The approach that we suggest is a multi-criteria assessment. You can look at to the technical criteria, ethical, social, environmental, and economic, and other criteria. It's depend on your preference and your need and a specific type of the project that we involve. But if you focus on social, environmental, and economic criteria, that is called triple bottom line. So triple bottom line is a multi-criteria assessment in sustainability, which is focuses on social, environmental, and financial or economic criteria. So to do a triple bottom lines, you need to take 5 steps. The first step is to identify strategies. In terms of the case study that we just talked about, you have already developed the strategies. The second stage is to identify criteria, social criteria, environmental and economic. In terms of social, you can, for example, focus on using health and safety of the equipment, in terms of other health issue and then noise, for example. In terms of environmental criteria, you can look at to the greenhouse gas emissions from them, waste generation from technique. And in terms of economic criteria, you can look at to capital investment or operating costs of the options, because different options, they have different investment needs, and also they need different operating costs. So those aspects can be considered as economic criteria for your multi-criteria assessment. Then the third stage is to evaluate the relative importance of criteria. Sustainability doesn't mean that social, environmental, and economic domain should be equally important. In some cases, social important can be twice as important as financial criteria, and vice versa, or environmental can be more important than social and economic criteria. So is that something that you need to decide in terms of weighing the criteria? And the fourth stage or step is to evaluate the relative performance of the options that you have against the criteria. Or you should be saying the relative importance of the what you have considered as options versus selection criteria. And in the fifth stage, or the last one, you need to normalize the performance result, because as we say, different criteria have different weight. So you need to adjust based on their importance. So if you do it in this, and you follow this step, you might come up with the figure like this one, which is you have options and performance, and the performance is between 0 to 1. And as you see here, option B, for example, one of the options you have is the best perform option, and you can say, yes, so option B from sustainability perspective is better than other options that we have. So if we have to choose one of the options or strategy in to comply with that requirement from, for example, from the wastewater company, so option B is the best one. But if you don't have to choose anyone, you can try to practical or practice all of the options that you have. The fourth step in this case study is compliance. Again, you need to establish an internal committee. We call it here water management committee, that the role of the committee is to set up KPIs, apply them to the business, get the feedback, and continuous improvement in the system or in the business to comply with the legislation. One thing about the case study that we just reviewed that is that the environmental or sustainability legislation and initiative don't need to be come from national level, country level, or a state level. It can be locally happen from, for example, council that you work with, or from wastewater treatment plant that you work with. So it just shows that how we are in a changing environment, and things or the new sustainable legislation might come to force, and you need to comply with them. Now let's have a look to indirect impacts. Again, we have one proposed approach to deal with the indirect impacts that you have. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, direct impacts are those that come from your supply chains. So your supplier needs to also comply with the relevant legislation and sustainability initiatives. So what we suggest here is that you start with mapping the value of change of your business, and you just identify the key legislation and schemes that affect that value chains, and identify what would be the risk of that legislation in your supplier to your own business, and then finally come up with the mitigation strategies. Here is another case study. It's just a hypothetical case study. Just imagine that you are a business that makes sandwich for supermarkets, and you wanted to know what would be the indirect impacts from the sustainability legislation on your business and your supply chain. So what you need to do is just look at the product that you have. Here is the bread, is the ham, is the lettuce and tomato that you have. And then as an example, I'm not going to the value chain of all of these products or materials. I just talk about one of them, which is the bread, and look at the value chain of the bread that you use in your business. So it's a picture of the white sandwich bread, and the price is $1.29, and that's the weight of them. So here is the value change of the bread that you use. It's a start from a farm in which farmers produce wheat, and then wheat is coming to a mill. is turned to flour, and then it's come to a bakery, and they make bread from that, and that bread is transported to a shop and supermarket that you buy your bread. So if you focus on the key strategies that impact the supply chain of the bread that you use, we talk about national fertilizer strategy. So if the farmer decide to comply with or reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, they need to invest in new technologies or new materials. For example, they need to replace the nitrogen fertilizer, the conventional nitrogen fertilizer, with the more advanced fertilizer that they have a coating on their external surface. So that coating or layer is just to stop greenhouse gas emissions quickly. So it just release nitrogen to the soil in more slowly, and that create a system that as a product of that system, there would be less greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. So changing from that conventional fertilizer to the new fertilizer, more sustainable fertilizer, require investment that impact the price that they definitely produce in their farms. And then if we come to a bakery that makes bread from the wheat that the farmer has already produced, there is the national packaging recycling strategy. So they have to pay levy for the plastic, soft plastic they use. We have also transportation in this supply chain and in the various locations. And if the truck drivers in this supply chain wanted to buy, for example, electrical vehicle truck or hydrogen fuel, and any investment in that one, that investment might affect the price that the product provide to the business. So that's kind of mapping the value chains and seeing what sustainability strategy will impact the business is a good way of estimating the indirect impact of sustainability legislation. Let's have a look to the economic impacts of them. Just imagine that or assume that the um, farmer has a 25 cents for the cost of the total cost of the bread, $1.29 that you pay. And that farmer just increased 10% in the wheat price because of the national, to complying with national fertilizer strategy. And we just assume that every other partner in this supply chain or players in this supply chain just increased by 10%. So that the result would be a reduction. It's just about increasing the bread price about $1.35. So it will add few cents to the bread that you buy it. So that's it's a kind of giving you a sense of the economic impacts that you have. But you need to also remember that there are other sustainability legislations that supply chains must comply with them, and they might increase, for example, people in the bakery, they decide to increase additional price or price increase to the system. So you need to just be mindful of the compounding effect of the price change in your product that you sell, and just estimating the economic impact of them. Now let's have a look at the mitigation strategy. So if you have that business that's selling sandwich, and you just come up with the economic impact assessment, you come up with the different price scenario, and you wanted to investigate how to mitigate this kind of risk, economic risk on your business. You have a number of options. For example, you just be more integrating more automation to your business, so reduce the cost of the production. You can have selectively diversify your production system. For example, in addition to selling sandwich, you add nuts or other, for example, product to your business. That might be a strategy for reducing risk. And you can also check if research efficiency can create some just like a buffer capacity in terms of coping with the increase in price of the raw materials that you have. So here is a list of mitigation strategy that you may consider. Now the last part of the workshop is a discussion about whether your business is ready. So after watching this video, I would like you to just have a reflection about the presentation and just think about the capacity of your business or organization to comply with the emerging sustainability legislation and commitment and schemes. For example, how your organization is good in collecting data. So do you have any system and structure to collect the data, for example, for modern slavery, for circular economy? I'm saying that specifically for circular economy because when it comes to data collection, most companies that are working with them in the circular economic space, when it comes to data collection, they just refer to the bill that they pay for a waste management, for example, they pay that for collecting solid waste from the company. But actually that bill is just a portion of the actual cost of waste management in a company. So that means that there are some hidden costs, for example, in terms of people that use a salary you pay them to manage waste, and also regularity of waste in terms of just complying with the waste collection regulation. So you need to also be mindful of the some hidden data that or secondary data that you also need to collect them, not just relying on the invoice or bill that you pay for your waste management. The second reflection is about turning data to insight. So you need to just have the capacity to turn the data that you have collected to insight to identify, for example, the hotspot in energy use, hotspot in greenhouse gas emissions, and dig down, for example, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions to just identify what's contributing to greenhouse gas. Is that the electricity? Is that the fuel from the petrol, for example, you use in your fleet, or what other sources? So going down to your production to supply chain, they are providing good insight for your compliance process. Also, please reflect on the ways that you can turn insight to strategies. For example, how much your business is familiar with waste management hierarchy that we discussed earlier, to the application of them to just assisting, for example, to the different strategies. Also, are you good or your business is capable of doing value chain analysis? You can identify what are the supply chains related to your business, who are the key players, and how vulnerable they are to, for example, changing in the price of the raw materials and etc. You also need to think and reflect on the capacity of your business for risk identification and mitigations to identify a risk, for example, modern slavery risk and mitigation of them. And finally, in terms of doing multi-criteria assessment and triple bottom line assessment. As you say that there are different capacities, capabilities involved in complying with the emerging legislation and schemes. So if you think that the current capacity of your business is not in the level that support you comply effectively with the legislation, please contact us. We are here to support you so we can help you in terms of identifying the key data that you need, primary data, secondary data, in terms of developing insight from your data that you have, coming up with the practical strategies and also value chain analysis. We have expertise in risk management and mitigation, and also um, doing triple bottom line assessment or multi-criteria assessment to help you select the best, the most sustainability strategy to comply with the legislation. So we can definitely support you in this space. If you need any support or you wanted to ask any question about this presentation, here is my contact details, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully in the future in any project or in any future presentation. Thank you so much. Have a good day.